You've been tracking your package for days, excited, anticipating, and finally, it's out for delivery. You race home, expecting to find it sitting on your doorstep, only to find nothing. You check the tracking, and it says, delivered. But there's no sign of your precious package. As you stand there, confused and frustrated, you spot your neighbor on her porch, sipping tea with a smug grin, like nothing's out of the ordinary. You decide to confront her. After all, she's been known to take packages from the neighborhood before. You walk up, try to keep your cool, and ask, "Did you happen to see a package delivered here for me?" She doesn't even blink, her smile widening, and she replies in the sweetest tone, "I don't know what you're talking about." You can feel the anger bubbling up, but this isn't the first time this has happened. She's made a habit of making life difficult for the neighbors, enforcing petty HOA rules and causing chaos without facing any consequences. But what happens next is beyond anything you could have imagined. Instead of letting this go, you decide to take action, something bold, something unexpected. You hatch a plan, one that will teach her a lesson she'll never forget. What does it involve? A skunk. Yes, you heard that right. A skunk. And when it's all said and done, Karen will learn that there are some people you should never mess with. Stick around to see how a simple package theft turned into the most outrageous and hilarious revenge plan you could ever imagine. Trust me, you won't believe how this all unfolds. This is Jamal. He's a man just trying to live his life, get through his workdays, and enjoy his downtime. He's a hard worker, a guy who doesn't mind putting in the hours to make sure he's got everything he needs. For Jamal, it wasn't just about getting by. He worked tirelessly for everything he had, from his car to his home, to that package he'd been anxiously awaiting. It wasn't just any package, it was something he'd ordered months ago, and after a few weeks of tracking, it was finally arriving. He had saved up for it and was so excited that it almost felt like Christmas. For days, he watched the delivery tracking like a hawk, just waiting for that confirmation email. When he got the notice that it had been delivered, he rushed home, expecting to see his package sitting on the porch. But when he arrived, there was nothing. The excitement quickly turned to confusion, and then to frustration. He checked the tracking again, but it was clear, his package had been dropped off, somewhere. His mind started racing, and that's when he saw Karen sitting on her porch with a smug smile, like she didn't have a care in the world. Jamal didn't know her very well, but the rumors were enough. She was the neighborhood HOA president, the one who acted like she owned the block. And then there was Karen. She wasn't just your average neighbor, she was the self-appointed queen of the block. She took the role of HOA president far too seriously, enforcing rules no one asked for and making everyone's life a little more difficult. You could never park in front of your own house without receiving a warning from her. You couldn't put up any holiday decorations without her complaining about violating community guidelines. It seemed like Karen had made it her mission to make everyone else's life as miserable as possible. The way she controlled the neighborhood with her strict enforcement of petty rules left people feeling trapped and frustrated. No one dared to stand up to her, until now. Jamal had had enough. It wasn't just about the package anymore. It was about standing up to the oppressive figure that Karen had become in the neighborhood. She had crossed a line this time. Stealing from Jamal wasn't just a petty act, it was the last straw. And Jamal wasn't about to let her get away with it. He was about to show Karen that some people just shouldn't be messed with. Jamal stood on his porch, his eyes scanning the area for his package. The excitement he had felt just moments ago evaporated as he looked around, but there was nothing. The delivery tracking had said it was delivered, so why wasn't it there? He paced back and forth, checking the time on his phone, thinking maybe he had missed it. No, it couldn't be. His package should have been right there, waiting for him. His mind raced, and the sinking feeling in his stomach grew heavier. He checked the tracking again, delivered at 3:12 p.m. His pulse quickened, and panic set in. He had been waiting for this moment for days. He had tracked every step of the delivery, making sure it was supposed to come today. And yet, nothing. He stepped down from the porch and began walking around the yard, searching for any sign of it, any clue. But nothing. Not a box in sight. That's when he saw her. Karen, sitting on her porch, as calm and collected as ever, sipping her tea like nothing was out of the ordinary. She had always been a bit off, controlling, bossy, and more involved in the neighborhood than anyone ever wanted. As the president of the HOA, Karen ruled the block with an iron fist, enforcing bizarre and petty rules that nobody else seemed to care about. Her presence was a constant source of frustration for everyone in the neighborhood. And now, Jamal couldn't help but notice how perfectly content she seemed as he stood there, feeling the rising tension in his chest. She was always around, keeping an eye on things, making sure everyone was living up to her standards, yet somehow, this package situation felt different. Something told him that she knew exactly what had happened to it. Jamal's heart started pounding in his chest. He had heard whispers from the neighbors before, rumors that Karen had been borrowing packages from other people. Little things, like taking in deliveries she claimed were mistakenly dropped off at her house, or not returning packages left on her porch, had piled up over time. But this? This was different. It was Jamal's package. And it had to be her. He wasn't the kind of guy to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were falling into place. The timing, her proximity, the way she was sitting there so innocently. His gut told him exactly where the package had gone. Taking a deep breath, Jamal walked over to her porch, his hands clenched into fists. He tried to steady his nerves, but his voice was firm as he asked, "Karen, where's my package?" The words felt like they hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Karen, her smile unwavering, looked at him with that same sickly sweet expression, as if she were the epitome of innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said with an almost rehearsed calmness, not even a flicker of guilt behind her eyes. It was as if she genuinely believed that whatever was going on wasn't her problem. Jamal's anger flared, but he kept his composure. He could feel his pulse in his ears, his thoughts spinning. Karen wasn't just denying it, she was acting like he was the crazy one. He could feel the walls closing in, the growing tension between them palpable. Jamal wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. He had worked too hard for that package, for the item inside it that he needed. This wasn't just about a package anymore, this was about standing up to her. He couldn't just let her get away with it, not again. Every time she had crossed a line in the neighborhood, people had just accepted it. No one had ever really called her out for her behavior, for her manipulation of everyone around her. But Jamal was done being pushed around. He stared at Karen, eyes narrowed, but her expression didn't change. "I know you took it," he said, his voice steady despite the surge of anger inside him. But she just continued to smile, as if he were imagining the whole thing. The words hung in the air for a moment longer, but Jamal knew this wasn't over. The tension between them had shifted, it wasn't just a confrontation over a lost package anymore. This was going to escalate, and Jamal was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't going to let Karen's smugness go unchallenged. Not now, not ever. Jamal couldn't believe it. He stood there on the porch, fists clenched, trying to keep his composure while Karen just sat there, denying everything. The anger he felt was bubbling up, but it wasn't just about the package anymore. It was about the principle of it all. Karen had crossed a line, and Jamal wasn't the type of person to just let it slide. He wasn't going to let her get away with stealing his things and making everyone's life miserable. He needed to make her understand what it felt like to mess with the wrong person, to feel the consequences of her actions. He needed a plan, something bold, something that would send a message. And in that moment, it hit him. What if he gave Karen a taste of her own medicine, but with a twist? She'd been making everyone's life hell with her petty HOA rules, taking what didn't belong to her, and acting like she was untouchable. Maybe it was time to show her that there were some lines you just didn't cross. Jamal's mind raced as he brainstormed ideas. Something extreme, something unforgettable. That's when it hit him. He wasn't just going to return a lost package. He wasn't going to just slap a fine on her for her HOA antics. No, this was going to be something bigger. Something that would shake her to her core. Jamal knew a guy who worked with animal control. His name was Ray, and Ray had connections that would come in handy right now. Jamal's fingers hovered over the phone as he made the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe he was about to do this, but at the same time, a wicked smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Ray picked up after the second ring. "Yo, what's up?" he asked casually. Jamal wasted no time. "Hey man, I need a favor," he said, keeping his voice steady but low. "I need a skunk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jamal could almost hear Ray's disbelief. "A skunk?" Ray repeated, clearly confused. "Yeah, a skunk," Jamal confirmed, his tone firm. "I need it for a little surprise for someone." Ray chuckled nervously. "You're crazy, man, but I think I can help. I'll call around and see what I can do." Jamal hung up, his heart racing. He had the plan. Now, he just needed to make it happen. The next day, Ray called him back with good news. "I got one for you," Ray said. "I'll meet you in an hour." Jamal couldn't believe his luck. He drove over to meet Ray, who handed him a small box, carefully sealed. Jamal's stomach twisted with a mixture of excitement and nerves. He knew what he was doing was extreme, maybe even illegal in some states, but at this point, he didn't care. Karen had it coming. As Jamal prepared for the big moment, he couldn't help but laugh to himself. This was ridiculous, and he knew it. But the more he thought about it, the more satisfying it seemed. The idea of Karen's smug face as she opened the box and was confronted with the surprise inside filled him with a twisted sense of justice. He knew she'd get what she deserved. He wasn't just going to sit back and take it. He was going to fight back, and he was going to do it in a way that would make her think twice before ever messing with him, or anyone else in the neighborhood, again. The skunk was small, but it was powerful. Jamal had read up on skunks and their defensive spray, and he knew that once it was released, it would make a lasting impact. The smell would be unbearable, and that was exactly the point. He couldn't wait to see Karen's reaction when she opened that box. But as Jamal prepared the delivery, he felt a twinge of hesitation. He knew the risks. Skunks weren't just cute little animals, they were wild creatures, and releasing one into a suburban neighborhood wasn't exactly the most responsible thing to do. But Karen wasn't exactly playing by the rules, was she? The more he thought about it, the more justified he felt. She'd been getting away with things for too long, using her position of power to push people around. This was the payback she needed. Jamal double-checked the box, making sure everything was set. The skunk was nestled inside, and he secured the lid tightly. He was about to make a delivery, but this wasn't just any delivery. This was going to be a message. A message to Karen and anyone else who thought they could take advantage of people without consequences. As he walked toward her house, his heart raced, but there was also a strange sense of excitement in the air. He could already picture the look on her face when she opened that box. He didn't know if he was making the right choice, but in that moment, it felt like the only choice. Karen had pushed him too far, and now she was going to pay the price. The day of the delivery had finally arrived. Jamal's nerves were on edge as he carefully positioned the small box in his hands, double-checking that the skunk was securely nestled inside. He'd already prepared himself for the consequences, but part of him still couldn't believe he was actually going through with it. The box felt heavy, but it wasn't the weight of the skunk that made his stomach tighten, it was the anticipation of what was about to unfold. He couldn't deny the strange thrill that had been building within him for the past 24 hours. He had spent years watching Karen control the neighborhood, making people feel small and helpless under her petty rule, and now it was time for some sweet, poetic justice. As he approached her porch, Jamal glanced around, making sure no one was watching. The street was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets, and the only sounds that filled the air were his own footsteps. His heart pounded as he reached Karen's front door. Jamal had made sure everything was just right. The skunk was in its box, tightly sealed but still able to breathe. He'd even poked a tiny hole in the side of the box for ventilation, though he wasn't sure it would make much of a difference. After all, the point wasn't just to give her a surprise, it was to leave a lasting impression. The revenge would come in the form of the skunk's infamous defense mechanism, one that could send even the bravest person running for cover. He carefully set the box down on her doorstep, making sure it was positioned perfectly in the middle, and then took a deep breath. Jamal hesitated for just a moment, realizing that once he rang that doorbell, there would be no turning back. But Karen had made her bed. She had stolen from him. She had made his life, and the lives of his neighbors, a living hell with her petty HOA rules. She deserved this. Jamal rang the doorbell and then bolted for cover. He ducked behind a bush on the side of her house, heart pounding, his breath shallow in anticipation. Every second felt like an eternity as he crouched, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when she would open the door and fall into the trap he had so carefully set. The adrenaline coursed through his veins as his mind played out the scene again and again. He could almost picture it now, Karen's smug face as she walked out, oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. He could see the moment when the skunk would spring from its box, the look of shock on her face as she realized what was happening. The seconds dragged on. Jamal's fingers twitched with the urge to peek out, but he stayed hidden, unwilling to risk missing the payoff. He could hear movement from inside the house, a creak of the floorboards, the sound of footsteps approaching. Jamal's pulse quickened. It was happening. Slowly, the door creaked open, and Karen stepped out onto her porch, her face bathed in the soft light of the porch lamp. She didn't seem to notice the box at first. She was probably too focused on whatever else was going on in her mind, but when she finally glanced down, her eyes narrowed in confusion. Jamal couldn't help but feel a momentary flicker of satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming. With a quick motion, Karen bent down and lifted the box, the curiosity evident in her face. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he waited, watching from behind the bushes with bated breath. For a split second, everything seemed to pause, time stretched, the anticipation building to a fever pitch. Then, in an instant, it happened. The skunk shot out of the box like a bolt of lightning. It didn't hesitate, didn't waste a second. Its instincts kicked in immediately. The pungent odor hit Karen before she even knew what was happening. A sharp, acrid scent filled the air, and the moment Karen realized what had just happened, she screamed, an ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Her face twisted in shock and disgust as she stumbled backward, hands waving in the air, trying to escape the overpowering smell that had already started to cling to her clothes and skin. In her panic, Karen lost her footing, her arms flailing as she tumbled backward into her flower bed, knocking over a few plants as she fell. She scrambled to get up, her feet slipping on the wet grass, but the skunk wasn't done. It darted around, skittering across the yard in a frenzy, and for a brief moment, Jamal wondered if it would make its way back toward him. But all of his focus was on Karen, on her wild, unhinged reaction. Her hair was a mess, her face contorted in disbelief, as she tried to stand and run back into the house. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. She was covered in the smell. Karen ran, her hands pressed over her nose, but the skunk spray had already done its job. The pungent odor was now a permanent part of her, she couldn't escape it. She bolted into her house, slamming the door behind her with a force that rattled the windows. Jamal stood there, still hidden, his heart racing as he processed the scene. It had worked. It had actually worked. The satisfaction that surged through him was indescribable. But he wasn't done yet. He didn't just want the momentary joy of seeing her stunned and embarrassed. No, Jamal wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done. After a few minutes, Jamal took a step back, still hidden in the bushes, trying to suppress the laugh that wanted to escape his lips. The neighborhood was silent once again, but in Jamal's chest, there was a sense of victory. He wasn't the one running for cover. He wasn't the one embarrassed or ashamed. This time, it was Karen. This time, the tables had turned. He had made sure that she wouldn't forget what it felt like to mess with the wrong person. As the seconds turned into minutes, Jamal could hear Karen inside, shouting something, though he couldn't make out the words. She was clearly upset, rightfully so, after the spectacle she had just experienced. But what Jamal knew in that moment was that it wasn't just about the smell. It was about standing up for himself, standing up for the neighbors who had been living in fear of Karen's reign for far too long. He had given her a taste of her own medicine. And now, she would have to deal with the consequences, just as he had for so many years under her thumb. Jamal stayed hidden for a few more moments, listening to the sounds of Karen's frantic movements inside her house. He knew it was over, at least, for now. His heart still thumped loudly in his chest, and a smile crept across his face. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was for sure: Karen would never look at a package the same way again. The aftermath of Jamal's bold move was anything but predictable. As Karen slammed the door behind her, trying to escape the overwhelming stench that now clung to her, the initial shock began to settle into something far more complicated. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Karen's voice, shrill and frantic, echoed from inside the house. Her neighbors, who had been quietly watching from their windows or porches, couldn't contain their curiosity any longer. One by one, they emerged onto their lawns, drawn to the commotion. Some were horrified by the scene they'd witnessed, unsure how to process the audacity of Jamal's prank. Others, however, seemed oddly entertained, and a few even suppressed chuckles at the sight of Karen, the woman who had made their lives hell for so long, stumbling backward into her flower bed, her face twisted in disbelief and disgust. Jamal, still hidden behind the bush, couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction as he watched the unfolding chaos. He knew he had crossed a line. What he'd done wasn't exactly legal, and he could face consequences for releasing a wild animal in a residential area. But at that moment, it didn't matter. He had been pushed too far by Karen's relentless HOA rule enforcement, her judgmental attitude, and her blatant disregard for others. He had spent months, even years, watching her control the neighborhood with her petty power plays, constantly making others feel inferior. Now, in one swift moment, she had received a lesson she would never forget. But Jamal's victory was short-lived. As he stood there, watching from a distance, a wave of doubt crept into his mind. He couldn't ignore the growing realization that Karen wasn't going to take this humiliation lying down. Her pride wouldn't allow it. He was right. Not long after the skunk had been safely delivered into the world of Karen's chaos, she quickly retreated inside, but it wasn't out of defeat. It was out of frustration. She was furious, that much was obvious. But more than that, she was embarrassed, and in Karen's world, nothing hurt more than losing control. The neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. The people who had quietly tolerated Karen's overbearing HOA leadership for years were now divided. Some stood by, nervously watching the aftermath, unsure of how far Jamal's act would go. Others were more vocal, talking amongst themselves about how they'd longed for someone to stand up to Karen's tyranny. One neighbor, Marcus, even jokingly commented, "Maybe now she'll take a vacation from enforcing parking rules." Another neighbor, Sandra, looked at Jamal, a little concerned. "You know she's not going to let this slide, right?" she warned. "You just poked a bear." Jamal didn't know what to think. On one hand, it felt like a huge win. He'd finally stood up to Karen in the only way that felt satisfying. But on the other hand, he realized the situation was far from over. He wasn't naive. He knew Karen. He knew how she operated. And he could already feel the storm brewing. Sure enough, just a few hours after the Skunk debacle, Jamal received his first taste of what was to come. A letter arrived from the HOA office. He opened it to find a formal complaint about his actions. Of course, the complaint didn't mention Karen's blatant theft of his package. No, this was an official reprimand for disturbing the peace and engaging in inappropriate behavior. Code 4, you messed with the queen bee. The letter warned that if Jamal didn't cooperate with the HOA's investigation, they would escalate things further. Jamal couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Karen had wasted no time in using her position as HOA president to target him. She knew her power in the neighborhood, and now she was wielding it like a sword, hoping to strike back at him. Jamal wasn't the only one who felt the heat. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the next few days were filled with tense, hushed conversations. People were whispering about the incident, some feeling empowered by what Jamal had done, others fearing Karen's wrath. It became clear that Karen wasn't about to let this go without a fight. She began spreading rumors that Jamal had intentionally endangered the community by releasing a wild animal, and she even contacted animal control, claiming that Jamal was responsible for the chaos the skunk had caused. In her mind, she was the victim, and Jamal was the villain. The HOA, loyal to Karen and her reign, seemed to back her up at every turn. They sent out a series of emails reminding the neighborhood of the proper procedures for package handling, for everyone's safety and peace of mind, though Jamal knew the real goal was to pressure him into backing down. The HOA began to demand that he meet with them in person, citing the potential fines he could face for his actions. The pressure was mounting. Jamal's phone rang incessantly with calls from the HOA office, from angry neighbors, and even from friends who had heard about the fallout. Everyone had an opinion, but it was clear, the community had become divided. Those who once feared Karen's leadership were emboldened, and those who had been loyal to her felt the need to defend her at all costs. Jamal knew he had to be smart. He had made a bold move, but it wasn't over. Karen was going to make him pay, and if he wasn't careful, the HOA could destroy his life. They could fine him, sue him, or even force him out of the neighborhood. But Jamal wasn't going to back down. He had made it this far without letting Karen dictate his life, and he wasn't going to start now. As the weeks passed, Jamal continued to face the consequences of his actions. He attended several tense meetings with the HOA, where Karen sat across from him with her arms crossed, staring him down with a look that could melt ice. She made veiled threats, implying that his reputation in the neighborhood could be tarnished if he didn't comply with their demands. But Jamal held his ground. He didn't budge. He continued to expose Karen's hypocrisy, revealing her own violations of HOA rules and how she had used her position to manipulate the neighbors. Slowly but surely, Jamal's story began to spread, and more neighbors started to speak out, sharing their own experiences with Karen's oppressive leadership. In the end, Jamal's actions sparked a movement within the neighborhood. The HOA began to fracture, and Karen's power started to slip. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices, rallying behind Jamal's cause. But Karen wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. And Jamal knew that as much as she would try to retaliate, the dynamic of the neighborhood had already begun to change. The battle wasn't over, but Jamal had won an important first round. Karen's revenge may have been inevitable, but now, the tables had turned, and Jamal was no longer afraid to fight back. He had exposed the flaws in her power and, in the process, had shown the neighborhood that it wasn't just about what she could take, it was about what they were willing to stand up for. The tension between Jamal and Karen reached its peak in the weeks following the infamous Skunk incident. Karen, furious and humiliated, wasn't the type to let something like this slide. She had spent years controlling the neighborhood with her petty rules, and now she was determined to make an example of Jamal. If she couldn't get back at him immediately, she'd make his life miserable until he had no choice but to back down. She wasn't the type of person to accept defeat quietly, and she quickly began mobilizing her allies within the HOA, putting pressure on every front. Karen started pointing out every minor infraction Jamal had ever committed, and the HOA quickly began targeting him for things as insignificant as leaving his trash cans out too long or not trimming the hedge in exactly the right way. The neighborhood, once quiet and peaceful, was now filled with whispers. Neighbors were afraid to take sides, unsure of the consequences of standing with Jamal, but some couldn't help but silently cheer him on. Meanwhile, Jamal found himself trapped in a battle that was beginning to feel like a personal vendetta. His mailbox was filled with warning notices from the HOA, and the fear of losing his home became a reality as the fines piled up. The pressure was intense. He was just one man against an entire system, and he knew that Karen wouldn't stop until she had destroyed him. But Jamal wasn't the type to give up. For the first time in his life, he realized that standing up to a bully required more than just defiance, it required strategy. He didn't have the money or the resources to outmuscle Karen, but he had something she didn't, the truth. And he knew that if he played his cards right, he could expose Karen for the hypocrite she truly was. Jamal started digging. He spent countless hours researching the HOA's policies, looking through old meeting minutes, and cross-referencing the bylaws with Karen's actions. What he discovered was eye-opening. Not only had Karen violated several HOA rules in her years as president, but the entire HOA had been operating illegally. Their meetings weren't properly documented, they had failed to notify residents of major decisions, and there were numerous instances of members making personal decisions about the neighborhood for their own benefit, including Karen herself. As he compiled his findings, Jamal knew he had something powerful. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Karen's position was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. With his evidence in hand, Jamal reached out to a lawyer, knowing that he needed professional help to take on the HOA and its corrupt leadership. His lawyer helped him draft a letter that would send shockwaves through the entire community. It was time to go public. Jamal filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Real Estate, accusing Karen and the HOA of illegal practices. He also shared his findings with the local news outlet, who were eager to pick up the story of a neighborhood corruption scandal. The letter outlined not only the illegal practices Karen had been involved in but also detailed the emotional and financial toll the HOA's actions had taken on residents, particularly Jamal. The response was swift. Within days, the HOA board was forced to hold an emergency meeting, and Karen was no longer the untouchable figure she once was. The pressure from the community was mounting, and even some of the neighbors who had initially been wary of Jamal began to speak out, voicing their concerns about Karen's overreach and her abusive control over the neighborhood. People who had once feared retribution from Karen now saw an opportunity to fight back, and the tide began to turn. The showdown came to a head at the emergency HOA meeting, where Jamal, accompanied by his lawyer, stood in front of a packed room of residents. Karen sat at the front, her expression cold and defensive. The board members, who had once stood by her, were now visibly uncomfortable, and a few had begun to shift in their seats, glancing nervously at one another. Jamal's heart raced as he laid out the evidence of Karen's illegal actions, detailing how she had manipulated the HOA's rules for her own gain, how she had made decisions without proper documentation, and how she had been taking advantage of her position to punish residents who dared to question her authority. One by one, the residents began to speak up, sharing their own stories of how Karen's reign of terror had affected their lives. There were murmurs of agreement, and Jamal could feel the tide shifting. Karen tried to interrupt, but the room was no longer on her side. People were finally seeing her for what she truly was, a bully who had used the HOA to control and intimidate others. In the end, the HOA board had no choice but to act. Karen was removed from her position as president, and the board members who had supported her began to distance themselves from the scandal. The community's trust in the HOA had been shattered, and Jamal, with his evidence and support from the neighborhood, had succeeded in exposing the corruption. He had won, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. The community voted for new leadership, and for the first time in years, people began to feel a sense of freedom. But Jamal didn't stop there. He negotiated a settlement with the HOA, securing compensation for the fines and legal fees he had incurred while fighting the board's harassment. The HOA was forced to pay him back for the emotional toll it had taken on him and his family. The settlement wasn't just financial, it was a victory that solidified Jamal's position in the neighborhood and sent a message to Karen and anyone else who thought they could abuse their power. Jamal didn't just survive the battle, he emerged victorious, and Karen had lost everything. As the dust settled, Jamal stood in front of his house, looking out at the quiet street. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. He had stood up to the bully, exposed the lies, and fought for what was right. Jamal had won the war, and while Karen might still be lurking in the shadows, she no longer held the power to control him or anyone else. The neighborhood had taken back its peace, and Jamal could finally breathe easy. The battle was over, and he had come out on top. Jamal's journey wasn't just about revenge, it was about standing up for what's right, no matter how overwhelming the odds may seem. Sometimes, the fight for justice doesn't come with a clear path or a perfect solution. Sometimes, it's about finding your strength, taking a stand, and showing that you won't let anyone, no matter how powerful, push you around. What started as a simple confrontation over a stolen package escalated into a fight for the soul of an entire neighborhood. And in the end, Jamal didn't just win back his package, he took back control for himself and the community. But here's the thing, this wasn't the first battle, and it won't be the last. In this world, there are always more Karens, more bullies, and more people who think they can get away with taking advantage of others. But Jamal proved that when you stand up and fight for what's right, the tide can turn, and justice can prevail. And if you think Karen got exactly what she deserved, and honestly, who wouldn't, then you need to stick around because there's so much more to come. If you enjoyed this insane story and want to hear more epic tales of standing up to the system, dealing with impossible situations, and seeing real justice unfold, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. There are always more stories, more conflicts, and more wild twists that'll keep you hooked. So go ahead, hit that notification bell while you're at it, this is just the beginning. You won't regret it. Stay tuned, because if you're a fan of karma, unexpected payback, and watching the tables turn in the most satisfying ways, you're in for a ride you'll want to follow all the way.